Hello and welcome to DocFest. My name's Danny Leigh. I think this is a fairly special event that we're about to have here. I think every generation of few filmmakers come along who change the way that we look at the form and whose films, I think, to some extent change who we are after we've seen them. We're very lucky to be joined by one of those filmmakers today, Joshua Oppenheimer. I'm assuming that most people will have seen certainly The Act of Killing, possibly The Look of Silence too. I want to kind of start at the beginning of that story and ask you, as a filmmaker, how you came to be in Indonesia in the first place, how that journey began.
Sure. In 2000, my background is not in documentary. I studied cinema filmmaking with Dusan Makavejev, who is one of the masters of the form and was making some of the most important films, I think, in film history in the 1970s. Films like WR, Mysteries of the Organism, Sweet Movie, Innocence Unprotected. He was my professor in film school and then sort of my mentor afterwards from Yugoslavia. And he explores the space between fiction and nonfiction. He would intercut in his films fiction material with fiction, sort of half of a film would be fiction, and then intercut with it would be these wild documentary strands that would turn the fiction into some kind of fever dream metaphor for something, I'm not quite sure what. And that inspired me also to explore the space between fiction and documentary, and I was doing so and more from the fiction side, and then in 2000, from 1997, when I left university to 2000, and then I started exploring more from a documentary space, and exploring really collaboration and performance in nonfiction with a group in London called Vision Machine Film Project. It was a group of collaborators and close friends. And then we were asked by the International Union of Food and Agricultural Workers, which is a union of unions in Geneva, so based in Geneva. So any food workers union, any agricultural worker, any member of a food or agricultural union anywhere in the world would likely be a member also of the IUF, the International Union of Food and Agricultural Workers, through their union. And they were trying to help educate their members, and they had 125 million members around the world, about the violence and the violence and the authoritarianism underpinning globalization. And they asked us to help a group of agricultural workers somewhere in the world where there was no where there were no unions because there was a military regime that had outlawed them. They asked us to help them make a film, their own film, about their struggle to organize a union. And we really could have been sent anywhere. We could have been sent to Malaysia was possible, Colombia was possible, parts of India that had been under martial law in the east, northeast were possible, but we were sent to Indonesia, and I knew nothing about Indonesia, and found myself at 26 years old, in the middle of, 14 years ago, in the middle of, on a Belgian-owned oil palm plantation in North Sumatra. It's the same plantation where Adi and his family lived, and where Ramli, his brother, in The Look of Silence. How many of you have seen The Look of Silence? So a minority, but a fair number. So The Look of Silence is about a family of survivors that live on this plantation, and I made that obviously many years later. I shot it 12 years after first going to Indonesia. But I found myself on a Belgian-owned oil palm plantation in North Sumatra where the conditions were deplorable. The company gave the women workers the job of spraying pesticides and herbicides. When I arrived, we found that the women workers who were spraying were dying in their 40s. They were getting liver disease and dying. And the first thing that they did as a fledgling union while we started making this film was to research which of the many chemicals they had to spray were causing this illness, if any. And it turned out there was one weed killer they were spraying with no protective clothing. It was going in their lungs and their bloodstreams and then their livers and killing them. And it was so toxic that anywhere else in the world, workers spraying that same herbicide would be wearing, moon suits. They would be completely protected from top to bottom, but they had nothing. They were given nothing in Indonesia. And one of the first actions, therefore, that this fledgling union tried to do was to go to the company, this Belgian company, and ask for protective clothing or no longer to have to spray that chemical. And the company didn't listen to their demands and instead hired a paramilitary group called Panchasila Youth. It's the organization in orange camouflage in the act of killing, to threaten and physically attack the workers. At which point the workers just dropped the demand. And I couldn't quite understand. I asked, how can you let this go so easily? After all, it's a matter of life and death, is it not? And they explained to me, well, you see, our parents and grandparents had been in a strong plantation workers union until 1965 and had been murdered for it. And this paramilitary group, Panchasila Youth, was the main death squad, civil group, the main organization behind the civilian death squads working with the army to kill our relatives. And they're still powerful, and we don't dare stand up to them or cause a problem with them. At which point I realized what was killing my friends was not merely poison, but also fear. And I started thinking at that point in early 2002, what can I do as a filmmaker to expose the mechanisms of this fear in the present, so that still not knowing much about what had happened in 1965, but what could we do to expose the mechanisms of this fear in the present, so that after seeing the film, if Indonesians saw the film, that perhaps it wouldn't work in the same way. The machine wouldn't work in the same way if people were aware of how it worked. I was starting to think that. Excuse me. And after the plantation workers finished making this first film, which they called the Globalization Tapes, they asked me to come back and make a second film with them about why they're still afraid, what it's like for them to live surrounded by the still powerful perpetrators, and consequently with the fear that this kind of violence could happen at any time again. And I returned right away as soon as we finished, submitted the globalization tapes to the International Union of Food and Agricultural Workers, and they started using it as a film to train workers around the world. As soon as that was finished, I went back to start my work with the survivors of the 1965 genocide. This was in early 2003. And it was then that I met Ramli's family, Adi's family. Because on that plantation, and for miles around, there was one victim, Ramli, whose name was synonymous with the whole genocide. And it turned out that the reason for that was because Ramli's murder, unlike the murders of tens of thousands of other people from that little area, Ramli's murder had witnesses. He had, if you've seen The Look of Silence, you'll know that he ran away the night that he was being killed. He ran home, he was picked up again, he was killed, dropped in another river, left for dead, and then dragged and killed in the plantation, and people found his body. So to speak about Ramli, Ramli's murder was undeniable. His grave was there in the plantation. And to speak about him was a kind of act of resistance, I think, and a way of insisting that these events really happened. Imagine a community that's so traumatized that people so traumatized by these events, but which the army and the government has for decades threatened never to speak about what had happened. That's a situation that makes one crazy. You're traumatized, but you can't talk about why. In a way, the whole condition of the family in The Look of Silence is that, and that's what the film's about, that traumatizing silence born of fear. But Ramli's murder, because it was undeniable, to speak about it was to insist that these events happened. It was like pinching yourself to remind yourself that you're still awake, that you're not crazy, that you're sane. And so people would speak about Ramli as a kind of act of resistance and as a kind of almost talisman. And it was inevitable that I would be introduced to Ramli's family as soon as I returned in 2003. I met his father and his mother. I fell in love with both of them. If you've seen The Look of Silence, his father's suffering from dementia, but when I met his father, he was really the force behind the whole film project and doing really well. But they wanted me to meet their youngest son, Adi, right away, because Rohani, Ramli's mother, felt that Adi was Ramli's replacement and said, you have to meet, if you want to understand Ramli, you want to understand what we went through, you must meet Adi, because he is like Ramli, he looks like Ramli, he has Ramli's personality. And because I had him, I was able to keep living. I was starting to go insane after his murder. and then I had Adi, and now I'm okay, or better. And so she introduced me, she called Adi to visit us, and Adi, the main character in The Look of Silence, he was born after the killings, and so he wasn't traumatized in the same way as his parents. He was, and yet he was desperate, eager to try and understand what had happened to his family to make everybody so afraid. His parents were so afraid, so traumatized that they never even told him what happened because they were afraid he would go to school and speak and talk and get in trouble with his teachers. Adi's teachers in elementary school were members of the death squad that killed his older brother, Ramli. If you imagine what it must be like as a parent being forced to send your children to school, to be taught in primary school by the men who killed your other children. It's unimaginable to me. And Adi, because he'd never heard really what happened, latched onto my filmmaking process as his way of trying to answer all these questions about what happened to his family, what happened to his mother, his father, his siblings to make them so traumatized, what happened to his village, what happened to his country. He started gathering survivors to tell me their stories, but within 3 weeks we were threatened not to continue. The army threatened everybody not to participate in the film. And so at that point, Adi and the other survivors said, don't give up, don't go home. If you can't film us, film the perpetrators. That led to the act of killing, and then only later I was able to go back and make the second film.
But how does that process begin? Because obviously you've decided and you've worked with Adi to start talking to the paramilitaries, to start talking to the killers. But then how simple is that a process to arrange? And also, once you do have them on camera, I'm interested in your immediate response, because I think for everyone who's seen the act of killing, you know, from that first scene with Anwar Congo, it feels so jarring and so obscene to see people glorying in their own murders. When you're standing behind the camera, obviously the act of killing, by the time most of us saw that film, we'd heard a little bit about it. We were a little bit prepared for what was going to happen. When you're standing there with Anwar, you're not prepared at all.
Yeah, well, Anwar was the 41st perpetrator I filmed. And I met him in July 2005, but I started filming perpetrators at Adi and his family's request in April 2003, so more than 2 years earlier. And we started with perpetrators in the plantation village, one of whom was my neighbor in that village. I hadn't known he was a perpetrator. And I was afraid to approach the perpetrators at first, but when I got over that fear, and I would go to them very simply and ask general questions like, what did you do for a living? Or I'm interested in the history of this region, what can you tell me? And within seconds, without having to build any trust, without having to convince them of my position at all, within seconds they would start recounting the worst details of the killings with smiles on their faces, as though, I would say, I now kind of realize, pretending to be proud of what they've done. But at that time I didn't know whether they were proud or not. They would talk about horrible things in front of their small grandchildren, and then within minutes of telling me what they'd done, they would typically invite me to the places they killed and want to show me how they killed and complain if they hadn't thought to bring along machetes to use as props or friends to play victims. And it was, and I would take this material back. I was horrified, to answer your question, and shocked. And I had a feeling that grew over time that I was getting something much closer to performance than to sober testimony, to remembrance. And I was able to check the facts that people were telling me by asking. I'd know about 2 people in the same death squad, and I would approach them separately and cross-check what they were telling me. But still, so it wasn't that they were lying about what they'd done, but there was something performative about how they were telling me what they'd done. And performance, I gradually came to understand, is intended for an audience. And the question was, who is their imagined audience? How do they want to be seen by me, by the people, whoever they imagined would watch my footage, by their grandchildren in front of whom they were boasting? How do they want to see themselves? That became the crucial question. And maybe how do they really see themselves? And for 8 months or so, I filmed them one-on-one, alone, because I knew I was afraid to bring them together. I thought if I brought 2 perpetrators together, one might tell the other, you shouldn't be talking about this, or you shouldn't be talking about it in this way. and we could be arrested, and I at that time only had one Indonesian crew member working with me, but it could be quite serious for him. And so to avoid that, I delayed as long as I filmed people alone. But after about 8 months, I had to understand, in seeking an answer to this question of who is their imagined audience, I had to understand how would they speak together. So I brought two men together and filmed one scene that really inspired both films. And this was in January 2004, and because only a minority of you have seen The Look of Silence, maybe I'll show a brief piece of it. So this was a terrible afternoon for me. And as they continue talking about what they did, demonstrating what they did at the river, that one spot, 10,500 people were killed. And as they go through talking about how they participated in that, they revealed that they actually killed Ramli, that the man in the blue shirt, Amir Hassan, revealed that he killed Ramli. And that was unexpected to me, so I think added to my shock. And at the end of the day, and it's at the end, all of this is in The Look of Silence, they pull out a point and shoot stills camera to pose for snapshots, to kind of remember, have as souvenirs of a happy afternoon out. And it was in that moment, I think, that it occurred to me, it's as though the Nazis had won World War II. And not only that, the rest of the world had celebrated what had happened. The rest of the world had celebrated the Holocaust as it was taking place. This is perhaps then how the aging death squad leaders, SS officers, would be speaking if that had happened. And I had this, I suppose that was the day, the reason it was really so upsetting to me was I had been clinging to some hope maybe that these men were psychotic, that they were monsters. And that was the day when I realized, no, that they're even worse when they're together. And they're clearly reading from a shared script. They didn't know each other. This was the first day I'd brought two men together who did not know each other, yet they were reading from this shared script. At which point I understood that this performance, I still didn't know who it was intended for really, but this performance was systemic and political and related to impunity. And clearly, if there was psychosis here, it was a political and collective psychosis. And because of my experience on that plantation, I understood how the fear from being surrounded by men, perpetrators in power who would speak this way, I understood how that fear was an essential part of why palm oil, and actually knowing the North Sumatran plantation belt, also rubber and cocoa and tobacco, why these products are so cheap. Not to say not costly. They were costing my friends their lives, but they're cheap. And I understood that we enjoy the benefits of these products all being so cheap. They make skin cream cheap, they make potato chips cheap, they make all sorts of any processed food that has palm oil in it, makeup, all of that's cheap because the companies would rather allow the production to cost human life than to cost money. And so I had this feeling that this awful situation of what if the Nazis had won World War II was not, in fact, this surreal freak science fiction scenario, not the exception to the rule, but the rule itself, because I understood that there were massacres and traumatic histories like this across the global South, from Latin America to Southeast Asia to China, that were keeping, and that people living in fear across the global South were making virtually everything we buy in conditions of fear, and that's why everything we buy is so cheap. And I realized that this is not the exception to the rule, but the rule itself. That this kind of impunity, what if the Nazis had won, is the story of our times. And I decided at that point to stop everything I was doing and spend as many years as it would take to address this situation. I went home that night and made a note in my diary that I should make 2 films. And one of them I knew would be a film about the perpetrators, about this trying to understand who is the audience for this perpetrator, the boasting of the perpetrators. How do they want to see themselves? How do they see themselves? I gradually came to understand that would be a story or a film about the stories, the lies, the fantasies that the perpetrators tell themselves so that they can live with themselves in the present and and in that sense, it's really a film, The Act of Killing I'm now talking about, a film about escapism and fantasy and guilt. And it is a kind of flamboyant fever dream of a film. Especially if you see, I think, the uncut version of the film, the so-called director's cut, but it's really just the original and uncut movie. And it's out on DVD and Blu-ray and iTunes here in the UK. So if you only saw a shorter version, there's two versions. There's a 2-hour version and a 2-hour and 40-minute version. If you've only seen the 2-hour version, you can see the full version. The last time I was at doing an event like this, or not a recent one, was with Werner Herzog in Berlin, and he announced in this incredible, with this authoritative voice that he had, he announced, if you have not seen the full version of The Act of Killing, then you have not seen it. So if you haven't, seek it out, if you want to, only if you want to see it. But especially in the full version, it really becomes a kind of fever dream of a film. I'm not sure it's a documentary at all anymore. I think it's it's certainly nonfiction, but I'm not sure it's documenting any kind of obviously visible part of our world. But it is documenting the imagination. But we're rather getting lost in the imagination there. Anyways, I knew there would be that first film, but I also knew I would make a second film which would complete the first one, or you could say the first one would complete the second one. That is to say, the two films would form a single work whose whole, I hope, would be greater than the sum of the parts. And the second film would deal with an equally urgent, equally contemporary aspect of impunity, which is, what does it do to human beings to have to live for 50 years in fear? What does the silence do? What does it do to not be able to mourn or to grieve or to work through trauma? What does that do to our ability what does it do to memory? What does it do to our relationships? What does it do to our relationships with our neighbors, with our parents, with our children, and with our own pasts? And that film, The Look of Silence, I hoped would be a kind of backward-looking film, a kind of film, a poem, if you like, composed in memoriam to all that's destroyed, not just the lives taken by the genocide, but the terrible and important sense that the genocide does not end so long as the perpetrators remain in power, everybody else remains afraid, and consequently, people remain traumatized. In that sense, I wanted it to be a poem composed in memoriam for all the lives that are broken by decade after decade of fear in the aftermath of the genocide, the silence in the aftermath of the genocide. And because I felt that whatever justice may come in the future, whatever reconciliation, whatever truth and reconciliation process may come in the future, it will not make whole, it cannot make whole the lives of Ramli and Adi's mother and father, and millions of other survivors whose lives have been destroyed through fear. And that, of course, is the second film, and I returned to shoot it in 2012 after editing The Act of Killing, but before it had its first screenings, at which point I knew I could no longer safely return to Indonesia. When I returned to Indonesia in 2012 after editing The Act of Killing, I said I didn't know that Adi would be the main character of the film, but he had been, in a way, my main collaborator. I knew he would be my main collaborator making the film, and he'd been a very important friend to me while making The Act of Killing. Indeed, from the time he asked me to start filming the perpetrators in 2003, he would watch everything I had time to show him. And while I was shooting The Act of Killing, he would come to our house where we were based in Medan, the city and capital of North Sumatra, while we were shooting the film, every evening and ask, what did you shoot today? And I often didn't have time to show him the material, and if I didn't have time, though, someone else from the crew would always sit with him and watch what we had shot, or some of it, selects. And he gradually, I understood, changed through this process. So midway through shooting The Act of Killing, maybe in 2007, 2008, I learned that as a door-to-door optometrist, he would go door-to-door testing people's eyes and selling glasses. He started to deliberately seek out men who were in their 70s and 60s who would remember what happened in 1965, and women, to ask them what they remembered while testing their eyes. And he would sometimes be rebuffed. He would sometimes be told this is too dangerous to talk about. Sometimes people would reveal very, very painful stories. Sometimes people would turn out to be perpetrators. Sometimes people would turn out to be survivors. But I understood he was doing this as a result of his exposure to all this footage that I'd shot with the perpetrators and that he was watching. And in 2012, when I returned, I asked him, Adi, how do you think we should begin in making this second film? Actually 2 years before that, when I started editing The Act of Killing, when we finished shooting in 2010, I'd given him a small video camera to use as a kind of visual notebook to look for metaphors that would maybe inspire the second film. And he said, I want to show you something. First he said, before showing me, he said, I need to confront, I spent 7 years watching the footage you shot with the perpetrators, and it's changed me. And I now need to go meet the men who killed my brother. And I said, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. There has never been a nonfiction film where a survivor is confronting the perpetrators while the perpetrators still hold a monopoly on power, because it's too dangerous. We can't do that. It'll endanger you, my crew, me, your family. No. And he said, let me explain why this is so important to me. And took out that camera and, trembling, said, there's one tape I did not send you while you were editing. He was sending me tapes while I was editing The Act of Killing. He said, I kept this tape because it's very personal to me. And trembling, he put it in the camera, pressed play, immediately started to cry and played me this scene. And said, this was the first day that my father could not remember any of his children, or my mother. And it was the end of Ramadan, so the whole family was together celebrating the Eid al-Fitr holiday, and he was just lost and frightened all day, and none of us could comfort him because we were strangers to him. And it became unbearable for me watching him raving all day, unable to help him. So I picked up the camera, which I'd brought along, actually not to film for you, but just as a kind of to make family home videos. I picked up the camera and filmed. And I felt angry at myself. Why am I filming when I can't help him? And then I realized I wanted to document this moment. He explained to me, I wanted to document this moment because this is the day that it becomes too late for my father. He's forgotten the son whose murder destroyed my family's, his life, his whole family's life, but he hasn't forgotten the fear. So it's too late for him to work through or to heal because he can't remember what happened. He can't talk about it. It's too late to get out of that, to heal, to mourn, to grieve, to move past the fear. So he's like, he said, a man locked in a room who can't even find the door, let alone the key. And he looked at me and said, I don't want my children, you see, to inherit this prison of fear from my father, my mother, and from me. And if I meet the perpetrators, if I go to them with gentleness and with understanding and a desire clearly trying to understand how they feel about what they did, he said, I'm quite sure that they will recognize, that they will see they will welcome my coming as a kind of as an opportunity that they've unconsciously longed for, to get this off their chest, to stop boasting and say, okay, look, this is what we did and we know it's wrong. And of course, at that point, I'll be able to separate their humanity from the crime that they've committed and forgive the human being. And then we will finally be able to live together as human beings instead of as survivor and victim afraid of each other. We'll be neighbors again. And you don't simply say no to such a request. I was very moved, and I went back to my crew and I said, okay, let me think if there's some way we can do this safely. And I realized at that point, talking to my crew, we realized that the creation of The Act of Killing was famous across that whole region. If you remember, in The Act of Killing, there's a talk show celebrating the production of the film before the film is even finished being shot. It was a big story in the region that I was working with, the vice president of the country, the minister thugs. Basically, he's the Minister of Youth and Sport, but really he's youth is a euphemism for thug, and sport is thrown in as kind of window dressing. And so the Minister of Gangsters is kind of the minister of the shadow state that has grown out of the ashes of the genocide, was participating in the film, that the national head of the paramilitary movement was participating in the film. This became a big story across the region, and we realized that the men Adi wanted to meet were regionally but not nationally powerful, and they would have to think 2 or 3 times, therefore, before physically attacking us, because they would not want to anger their superiors who they thought were close to us. And while I'm still close with Anwar Congo and Herman Koto, the 2 main characters in the act of killing, those high-ranking politicians hate me. And yet, because the film hadn't been seen yet, it hadn't been screened, I was still thought to be close to them. So that allowed that unique situation of having shot a film like The Act of Killing but not yet having screened it, became this window in which we could do this unprecedented thing safely of Adi confronting the perpetrators. I realized 2 things, though, after we discovered that this might be possible. I realized that we would not likely get the apology that Adi was seeking. I'd spent 5 years working with Anwar Congo, and at the end of the film, in the final scene, he's able to feel fine. He's never able to say what I did was wrong, consciously and consistently and without any caveats. But he is, in the final scene, able to glimpse the horror of what he's done without any mediation of performance. And what happens to his body there, what I mean by that is not that he's not aware of the camera. Of course he is. But when he's retching, but what I mean by that is when we see perpetrators who've been forced to admit what they've done was wrong. For example, aging Nazis in the aging Nazi commander from Treblinka in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, for example. We see shame. They act ashamed of what they've done. But they perform that shame. It's a kind of performance of shame, a kind of hollow performance of shame. And we might be tempted to say, oh, that's because they don't feel guilt. But I think I learned making The Act of Killing that the performance of shame, they perform shame. The shame appears hollow because to actually feel shame would be to experience what Anwar Congo is experiencing on the roof at the end. It would be physically traumatic. I don't think I've seen many places maybe I've never seen any place I've never seen in cinema what guilt does to a human body apart from that, in that unmediated way, apart from the end of The Act of Killing. And I think somehow I felt that the men that Adi would want to confront would be unable to go to that place in just an hour of meeting a survivor. And I told him that. I said, I don't think that you'll get the apology you're looking for, but I think if I'm careful and if we find a way of filming the perpetrator's reactions, perhaps we can show the abyss of fear, guilt, and the perpetrator's fear of their own guilt that divides neighbor from neighbor and family member from family member, and indeed almost many Indonesians from their own selves. And if we can do that through the film as a whole, we can maybe show how torn the social fabric in Indonesia is and how urgently truth, reconciliation, and some form of justice are needed, and then inspire a younger generation of Indonesians, people your age and below, to struggle for that. But I don't think we'll succeed we may fail in the individual confrontations, but succeed in a bigger way through the film. And I told him that. He didn't give up his hope for the apology ever. But I also realized that this should be not a film simply about impunity and coexistence. This should be fundamentally a film about memory and oblivion, because that's the real casualty of living for decades in fear. That's what Adi was trying to show me with the scene we just watched. And I realized at that point, I thought, if I succeed in composing this poem to the victims of oblivion and fear, the litmus test of my success will be whether I can successfully, at least for some of my audience, end the film with that scene that Adi shot.
I'm interested in terms of the perpetrator's kind of initial candor, how much you think that was down to purely the fact that you were there as an American filmmaker, because one of the things that comes through in The Act of Killing and in The Look of Silence as well is the idea that among the thugs there's this sense that you are politically, culturally on their side. And there's that sense at the end of The Look of Silence, one of the family members said, "Oh, I used to trust you, Joshua, but I don't like you anymore." And that's almost like the story of both films for some of the characters. It's that sense that, well, here's this American guy who's one of us, and then they suddenly realise, or at least some of them realise.
Well, we hear, and that's I think it's absolutely true that my being American helped. And I think if I were, for example, Chinese or certainly Indonesian, I could never have safely made these two films. And I never felt, I should say, before I really answer your question, I never felt, though, in making this work, like I was trying to make, as an American, I was living in London while I made the films, and then in Denmark as an American and British, and then latterly Danish filmmaker. I never felt I was working as a foreign filmmaker to bring this story to you, honestly. I'm glad you're interested. But it never was my first thought. I always felt first and foremost that I was a kind of agent working for the survivors and the human rights community to do a work that they clearly could not safely do themselves. So sometimes I'm asked, how could you as a Western filmmaker go in and do this? I couldn't have done this if I were not a Western filmmaker, but I did it as an agent, if you like, of the human rights community in Indonesia, and that's another story I'm sure we'll talk about later, about central to how the films have been released in Indonesia and how they've been the National Human Rights Commission in Indonesia, part of the government actually, is the distributor, the official distributor of The Look of Silence in Indonesia. But I don't think that the perpetrators limited their boasting to me. When I would film the perpetrators telling horrific stories in front of their own family members, the first 40 perpetrators that I filmed before I met Anwar, the family members would look on board as though they'd heard the stories many times before. And I actually came to believe, and I think confirmed with Adi, that the reason Adi thought the perpetrators would speak to me is because Adi knew that the perpetrators would boast. Because the survivors had lived surrounded by boastful perpetrators for decades. The boasting, the storytelling, this grisly storytelling actually is part of the mechanism of this regime of fear. I even thought that when I filmed that scene of the two men going down to the river. I thought if these men, you imagine that when I was thinking about what if the Nazis had won and the world had celebrated the Holocaust while it was taking place, I imagined that perhaps the Third Reich government would encourage the SS officers to go back to their villages, or at least tacitly approve of it, and boast about what they'd done, because they would become inevitably these feared proxies of the state. And I think that's, so I think that, and I think in terms of, I came to understand why are the perpetrators boasting. I think it has more to do with, I think if you imagine, these men have seen horrific things. Anwar Congo watched people be strangled to death 1,000 times. He watched people, he would cut off people's heads and see the results. These images would come to him and haunt him in his nightmares. These rotten memories that sort of are beyond description. And I think actually the effort of trying to dramatize them and put words to them is actually a way of trying to make them safer. There's a need to talk about it, in part to kind of replace these unspeakable horrors with the relatively safe domain of words and images. It's a kind of creation of almost of a cinematic psychic scar tissue around this sort of primordial wound. But I also think because they've never been removed from power, they still have available to them a victor's history celebrating what they've done. So there's an ability or an attempt to wrap, if you like, to sugarcoat these rotten memories and these bitter memories with the sweet rhetoric of a victor's history. But somehow, and I think every fiction scene that Anwar creates is kind of an attempt to do that. And then when he watches those scenes, and again in the director's cut of the film you really see this process several times, Anwar watching after each of his big dramatizations, him watching his footage and proposing the next film. And there's really a lot of time in the director's cut for the doubt on Anwar's face. We really feel that he doesn't believe his own lies, and we feel that crack growing and widening until it becomes a real abyss for him. And I think that there's always some excess that oozes out of the cracks in this sugar coating. But I think that need, the availability of a victor's history, because they're still in power, and the need to sugarcoat these bitter memories is somehow and then the need to share it with someone, and the need to put something awful in words and sort of make it a little safer, the way you have the need to tell your nightmare to your partner after you wake up from one in the middle of the night, if you are lucky enough to have someone by your side when you wake up from a nightmare. It's that same need, I think, and it's something very human, and I think that's responsible for the boasting. I think viewers, particularly of the shorter cut of The Act of Killing, sometimes are prone, they have less time with Anwar's cracks and less time with that growing doubt than in the longer cut. And I think they sometimes fall prey to a very typical human misunderstanding, which we all do, which is to misunderstand the perpetrator's boasting. I think, although we all know what I'm about to say, we always misunderstand people when they boast. We're very vulnerable to boasting in the following sense. When people boast to us, we assume they're proud. But actually, if you think about it for just 1 second, we actually know that when people boast to us, they do so because they're insecure, and they're compensating for an insecurity. That's why people boast. And it's that same compensatory quality that I think is motivating the boasting. Now, to genuinely build trust, so that they would open up with me about their nightmares and their pain, particularly Anwar, and certainly the high-ranking political figures, to sort of trust the project politically, I think it certainly helped that I was American. And in The Look of Silence, we see two very chilling scenes. One where a death squad leader tells us that it was the Americans who taught them to hate the communists. And in fact, he went on to describe how the American consul encouraged them to kill the communists. And another scene from NBC News, which perhaps it's also worth showing.
Absolutely.
I'm glad that there were some chuckles in the first part when we hear this absurd lie that the communists asked to be killed. Because we are laughing, of course, as many viewers do during the act of killing, and I think rightly, at the absurdity of the lie. But I also want to just point out, and it's of course an Indonesian person lying, telling this lie that the communists wanted to be killed after saying Bali's now more beautiful after a mass killing. And recently, a little tangent there. Recently, a year ago, at the Hyatt Regency Resort, a 5-star resort, a beach resort in Bali, there was a big storm, and part of the gardens washed away to reveal a mass grave. The tourists came out the next morning to assess the damage and saw skeletons flowing out onto the beach. So there's this lie told by the Indonesians. It's sort of absurd and surreal, or told by this Indonesian. Actually, he's an archaeology professor. He's introduced earlier in the program as such, Dr. Rada. Told by him. But moments later, we learn that actually Goodyear, a major multinational American company, is using slave labor to harvest rubber. And the prisoners are staying in a concentration camp from which they're being starved to death or dispatched out to death squads to be killed. And this is reported as though there's no moral problem here on American news, just 20 years after the Germans used prison labor at the Auschwitz death camp. And German multinational or German corporations to use prison labor at Auschwitz. American corporations are doing essentially the same thing as what was taking place at Auschwitz just 20 years after Auschwitz. This is obviously a pretty profound stain on the US's claim to be a force for freedom and democracy in the post-war world. And I think does explain why my being an American allowed me to do this. But I would say, going back to your question, that wasn't the source of their boasting.
Sure. I'm going to ask one more question and then hand over. Psychologically, I mean, you mentioned the abyss just now, but you've spent many years, I think, staring into the abyss with these films. I mean, psychologically, how grueling did it get for you?
There's a scene, I'm going to show it. How many of you have seen the long version of The Act of Killing? So only a minority, so I'm going to show this scene.
I mean, I'm thinking the film noir, weirdly, of all the very unsettling sequences from that film, it's the film noir kind of restaging. That, I mean, that's a scene that I think it's almost impossible to know how to process that mentally, but obviously you're there filming this.
Yeah, so in the middle of shooting that scene, this is, by the way, I think, perhaps the most important passage. It's a chunk of the most important passage in the long version, the 2.5-hour version of The Act of Killing that's missing in the short version. And what's so important about it, I think, is that as Anwar starts to realize, after they dramatize the attack on the village and he's sitting on this fishing platform in the middle of the night, talking about karma, and there's lightning behind him in the middle of the sea. He starts to realize that feel regret. He said, I think that there could be karma, and I'm afraid, and all I see is darkness in front of me. I think in response to that emerging guilt, he throws himself despairingly, hopelessly, into the worst of who he was, by somehow occupying or a kind of film noir anti-hero, because it's evil but glamorized. It's evil, but he can't escape after attempt after attempt to dramatize what he's done in a way to run away from his pain, to somehow fix the moral disaster by improving the scene aesthetically or changing the scene's mise en scène, the costumes, the genre, by making it more and more elaborate. And it always fails. There's always the rot always seeps through the sugar coating. I think he finally gives up and throws himself despairingly into the worst of what he did, but as a kind of glamorous anti-hero that allows him to live with that. And I think this is a part of who Anwar is long before he gets to this place in my process. I think in his dark moments, he thinks of himself this way. And of course, then his response, it's painful. It hurts him. It's awful. And he but what's hurt him? Killing has hurt him. And so it's like, by killing his victim, the victim, that's hurt him, so he blames the victim. By killing you, you've hurt me. And there's this blaming of the victim, and him feeling like his victim's victim, which I think is a crucial part of and it's an insightful moment in the film, in the mechanisms of evil, that leads to this kind of downward spiral, where you just become worse and worse and worse. You punish your victim for the guilt that the murder causes you, the torment that the murder causes you, in this kind of downward self-defeating spiral. And there he is blaming Herman, who's playing. It starts as this improvised game where Anwar says, "Hey Herman," that's not in the film, but he says, "Hey Herman, take that teddy bear and pretend it's your child." And it starts as a game. And by the end, he's saying, "You're the barbaric one." And having blamed the victim, he feels like his victim's victim, and he's lying in bed in this moment of self-pity, saying the torment, it's singing this song of self-pity. And from that, you just saw, comes to sit in the chair playing the victim. In the shorter version, it sort of looks like he starts to feel guilt after burning down the village, and from there, he out of guilt, decides he should play the victim. Maybe it's a kind of moment of remorse, or maybe I've asked him to do it as the next challenge. But in reality, what happened was there was this very important nightmarish loop where he throws himself into the worst of what he's done, not being able to escape the evil, and then feels pain and guilt and self-pity, and feeling self-pity feels like the victim's victim, and then plays the victim, because that's how he felt like a victim that day. He came in the next day to shoot and felt like a victim. That whole emotional line, that journey, is missing in the short version. I think it simply didn't fit at that length. And so I don't regret taking it out in order to make the film reach a wider audience at that length, but it's the biggest loss for that version. In any case, filming this scene, it was a very, because it started as a game, there was a cinematographer there who'd done this beautiful lighting and created this low-key film noir lighting that was sufficiently flexible that Anwar didn't have to worry about blocking and could move, but it would still be chiaroscuro and kind of low-key. But I picked up the camera because it started as a game, and I could hear while we were shooting, I could hear in my headphones that Anwar's microphone was rubbing. And so I cut the action to fix the microphone. And while I was fixing his microphone, he said, "Joshua, you're crying." Anwar was always the most thoughtful person on set. If someone cut themselves or anything happened, he was always worried about it. He saw I was crying. He said, "You're crying, Joshua. What should we do?" And I said, "Well, it's really terrible." And I actually didn't know I was crying. I felt my face, and it was there I was crying. And I said, "So I am." He said, "What should we do?" And I said, "Well, it's terrible, but we have to continue." And I almost wish I hadn't said that, because you could see at the end of that scene, Herman sitting there shaking his head. Even, Herman's devastated. We were all devastated. I went home that night feeling filthy, tainted, as though I had been the channel, or the film had been the kind of channel, the occasion through which this horror had come up. And I went home and felt feeling awful, tried to sleep, couldn't, after a while fell asleep and had an awful dream. Woke up, couldn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I couldn't sleep because I was afraid of the dream. I knew it would come back. The next night I collapsed. The next night I had another nightmare. And that cycle of nightmare, then insomnia, and then collapse went on for about 8 months. And it was difficult, to answer your question, to go into that space, this dark part of what it means to be human, and not to flinch, and to go in there insisting that every perpetrator I'm meeting is a human being. And that's the terrible, hopeful truth of this situation. Terrible because it means any one of us could potentially be the same thing in another situation. If any of you grew up in Anwar Congo or any of these men's families in 1950s Indonesia, come 1965, you might make different decisions. You would hope so, but you're very, very lucky never to have to find out. And knowing that, so it's a terrible truth that all the perpetrators are human, but it's hopeful too, because it means that actually among us there probably aren't monsters, or as Primo Levi put it, there might be some monsters among us, but they're too few to worry about. So essentially, we might be able to build a world where we care for each other better, where the bonds that connect us, which make us human, because we're not human as individuals. As an isolated individual, I can't feed myself, clothe myself. Like a baby rabbit, I would die for lack of affection. We are human through the bonds that connect us. And if we could look after those better, if we could practice empathy, if we could learn to care for one another and to empathize with one another, even the most remote stranger, the people making the raw materials that go into our skin cream and mobile phones and putting together our clothing, if we could learn to practice empathy for everybody with whom we are connected, and we could learn to think critically and doubt what we're told by authority, and we could teach that to our children, perhaps this kind of behavior, which should be truly unimaginable, might one day be unimaginable, rather than all too familiar and all too human. I felt, so it was painful to go into this place. It was painful to deny myself the escapism of saying these men are monsters and they should just be judged. It was painful to not give myself the comfort of saying my role is to judge them or build a case and condemn them. Because after all, the role of artists ought not to be that of a court. We ought to be trying to understand, not trying to condemn. We ought to be trying to empathize, not sympathize. And we should take it for granted that our audience is smart enough to understand that mass murder is wrong. If we don't understand that, we should get out of this business. If we think that our audience is too stupid to know that what Anwar just did in that scene is wrong, we should be doing something else. It is somehow our job to try and understand and to empathize, and that means being close to the people we film. And to do that for so long was painful. I had that long period, that nearly a year of insomnia. But making the look of, and nightmares, but making the look of silence, was not emotionally frightening in the same way. It was physically frightening, but emotionally very healing. And it was very, understanding while I was shooting it that this was the end of my journey in Indonesia, at least for a long time, until there's real change and I can go back safely. Working with Adi and his family and my wonderful, wonderful Indonesian crew, all of whom many of you will know if you've ever seen the credits in my film are anonymous, to protect their safety. That was a very healing and good way to end my journey there. And I just say one last thing. I think you come out of this encounter, if you overcome the fear of looking, you come out less afraid. If you overcome the fear of going in and not flinching and actually just looking, you come out stronger and less afraid. And I'm grateful and actually honored to have had the opportunity to spend this decade doing this, even though it was hard.
Let's hand it over to you. If you can put your hand in the air in time-honored fashion, I'll try and make sure hand went up very quickly here. As I say, there's a couple of microphones which will be doing the rounds. Need water? Yeah. Oh no, I'm fine, Josh. It was just over here, actually, just in the second row. Sorry, then I'll come to you next.
I'll try to be quick, but I would like to put forward two questions. One is about the criticism that your film has received, the act of killing, and about the moral question. So I would like to know at which point you decided to create this fiction of the film, the American film, all the glamour and everything, and if at that point you thought maybe this is going to offend someone, it's going to look like we are glamorizing violence. So I would like to know what you think about that, when that happened, and what were your thoughts about that. And the second question is, some criticism of your first film, The Act of Killing, was that the victims were not there. So I wonder if you have ever thought, or if you're thinking, about making a third film in which the perpetrators and the victims would be together in this coexistence that you wish for Indonesia. Thanks.
Well, I think I'll take the questions in reverse order. The look of silence is about the perpetrators and the victims together, or a family of survivors together, and their coexistence. And the dramatic spine of the film is these impossible, unfathomable confrontations where Adi, the man who you've seen close up watching the footage that he's watching there, goes and visits the men who killed his brother, sometimes testing their eyesight while they're recounting the horrible things they've done, and then confronting them, trying to get them to take responsibility for what they've done. None of them, as I actually had imagined, finds the courage to take responsibility. All of them get afraid and get angry. And I think they're afraid not of Adi. They know Adi has no power to cause them trouble, and they know I don't. They get afraid, I actually think, of themselves. They get afraid of the mirror, their conscience, the mirror that Adi's questions throw to them, or holds up to them. And so they get angry and they threaten him. But there's one daughter in one of the confrontations, one daughter of a perpetrator, who finds the courage and the humanity to apologize on her father's behalf. It's a very important moment in the film. I'm wondering if it's worth showing, or if we should just, we'll move on.
Little press for time.
We'll move on. So that I've made. And I think in terms, sometimes people do ask me, why don't you make a third film? Because somehow a trilogy is more common than a diptych. But my answer to that is that a diptych is more open. That the first film, and I'm talking about its impact, their impact in Indonesia, the first film has has helped to catalyze a fundamental transformation in how Indonesia talks about its past. The mainstream media in Indonesia used to say nothing about the genocide or talk about the heroic extermination of the communists. Now they report daily on the genocide as a crime against humanity and the horror of what happened, and particularly the present-day horror, the corruption, the impunity, the fear, things that everybody knew was there but was too afraid to talk about. The first film came in a way to Indonesia, The Act of Killing, like the child in the emperor's new clothes, and made it possible for people to talk about the most immediate problems that were right before their eyes. And into that space, and the film screened thousands of times across Indonesia, then we made it available for free online. It was downloaded millions of times. When the film was nominated for an Academy Award, the government, the president's spokesman finally said, look, we know what happened in 1965 was a crime against humanity. We know we need reconciliation, but we don't need a film to push us to do this. And so it was dismissive of the film, but it was wonderful because it was the first time the government of Indonesia ever acknowledged that what happened was wrong. And into the space opened by the act of killing, The Look of Silence has had a much wider release. It's been distributed, as I mentioned earlier, by the National Human Rights Commission, part of the government, whereas the act of killing had to begin its life in secret. The Look of Silence has been distributed by the government. The first screening of the film was held in Jakarta on November 10th last year. 3,000 people came because they put billboards around the city announcing it. Ari was at the premiere and received the most wonderful response from the audience. Then a month later, on International Human Rights Day, the film came out across the country with 500 public screenings on the same day. And now we're at over 3,500 screenings, and the film will soon be available online too for Indonesians. You can say that the first film opened the way, and the second film entered that space and showed, as I said earlier, how torn the society is and how urgently truth and reconciliation, some form of justice, is needed. And the daughter of that perpetrator, who finds the courage to apologize on her father's behalf, has become a kind of model for children in perpetrators' families to say, look, actually truth and reconciliation are within our grasp. It's nothing to be afraid of. More to be afraid of is the fear in which we're raising our children now, unless we change. So in terms of the first question, I'll say a little bit about how the method evolved, and then I hope from that it'll be clear what I thought that would do. I just want to say that for the criticism that the film provides a platform which glorifies murder, I think it's honestly a disingenuous criticism, because I don't think anybody who's seen it, and certainly not the people who've leveled that criticism, have ever felt that the perpetrators come away looking glorious. You cannot see the scene that you've just seen and feel that makes Anwar look glamorous or glorious. So I think it's a not real. Definitely those critics are unhappy with the film, but I don't think that's really the reason. I think they know it doesn't make the perpetrators look glamorous. They also don't have a platform. A platform is something you go up to. I have a platform now. I'm saying what I want to say. When I'm finished, I stop. They never have control over their footage, and in that sense, it's not a platform that the perpetrators have in making the film. Simply, I wanted, as I said earlier, to understand how the perpetrators want to be seen and how they see themselves. And so I offered them, long before I met Anwar Congo, I said, show me what you've done in whatever way you wish. I will film your dramatizations, and you will film your dramatizations, but I'll also film you and your fellow Death Squad veterans discussing what you want to show and what you want to leave out. And in that way, we will somehow document what this means to you and to your society and how you want to be seen for what you've done. And I never expected that there would be these elaborate Hollywood-inspired dramatizations. That evolved organically when I met the 41st perpetrator, Anwar Congo, and discovered that in Medan, where we made the film, the army recruited its killers from the ranks of movie theater gangsters who loved American movies. And what happened was, the reason I lingered on Anwar was I sensed his pain on the surface. And it was through Anwar that I realized that actually these men, that the boasting is not pride. It's the opposite, as I said earlier. It's a sign that they know what they've done is wrong and they're desperately clinging to lies so they can live with themselves. And so I showed Anwar the footage of himself. I took the risk of getting us all kicked out of Indonesia by screening for him the footage we were shooting, starting with that first scene on the roof. And when he watched it, he looks very disturbed. I'm sure he's terribly disturbed. But he doesn't dare admit what's wrong. He doesn't even dare say, this makes me look bad, because to say that would be to admit what he did was bad, and he's never been forced to do that before. So instead he lies to himself and to me and proposes a quote improvement, unquote, hoping that by fixing the scene aesthetically, by changing the mise en scène, gathering friends together, changing the costumes, he can improve the scene, his past, morally. And so we shoot the next scene, and I'm not doing it and then show him that. And we just kept repeating that process recursively. It's, as I mentioned, you see that recursive process several times more in the long version of the film. And Anwar always has the same doubt, the same pain in response to what he shot. And he always proposes ever more elaborate scene in response to run away, to dispel that doubt, to run away from the pain. And gradually, over time, the scenes evolved into something more and more surreal. I continue, and in the end, those scenes become a kind of prism through which he recognizes the true horror of what he's done. And in a way, that's not surprising, because after all, what's fueling the process from the beginning, I think, is in fact Anwar's conscience. Now, I wasn't agreeing to continue with this process because I wanted to take Anwar in a psychodrama. I agreed to continue with the process because I understood that every scene he was proposing was even more powerful fodder for the expose of present-day impunity that I'd been entrusted to create by the survivors in the human rights community. So it never occurred to me that this is a platform or could glamorize them, because actually it was all material for precisely what the film has become, which is an expose of present-day corruption and fear. And I just say one last thing, which is that emphasizing that this is about the present, I would say there are no reenactments in either film. You have not seen any, the clips I've shown you are not reenactments. Reenactments are a technique that filmmakers use to illustrate a past which is no longer available to be filmed. These are precisely dramatizations, even the simplest scenes, dramatizations of the stories, lies, fantasies, self-states that the perpetrators tell themselves so they can live with themselves. And that's a very important difference, because it is the difference between a film about the past and the present. These are films about the lies they're telling in the present.
No, we'll move on. No, I do need to move on, because we've only really got time for one more question, and the person over here was going to ask it before. So,
I'm very humbled to be the last question, and I'm also very humbled that when I was trying to take notes from what you were saying, Joshua, the act of killing came out as the act of skilling, because I'm that ham-fisted, and wanted to thank you and Addy for skilling me and skilling us in starting to begin to understand this process, to these atrocities and the consequences of that. And I was intrigued by one recurring visual metaphor and wanted to know how that happened with the jumping beans. First the children and then the mother talking to these little creatures trapped inside these hard nuts.
Yeah, they are, the family was, the children, Aisha, the daughter, found the beans and was playing with them, and then showed them to her brother, and I thought they were magical. And I knew that this film was a kind of poem about this silence which is not peaceful, the opposite of peaceful. It's a terrified silence. It's the silence of kind of nitroglycerin. And the idea was that if you could, the stillness of nitroglycerin, if you could somehow, and the aim of the two films is to somehow discharge that so that the danger can go. It's kind of to work the alchemy of, as I said earlier, the child in the emperor's new clothes who points at the king and says, look, the king is naked. Everyone knew it, but once it's talked about, they can finally address it and deal with something, the terrifying reality in front of them. The danger depends on people being silent. And so I knew I was making this film about that silence, and I was really trying to figure out, I was actually studying the works of André Bresson and Yasujiro Ozu in preparing the film, because I feel that they are our masters of silence in cinema. They are the people who understand the grammar of silence, the language of silence, how you construct what appears to be a dialogue scene around silences, where in the silence no words are being spoken, but everything is being said. And I felt that in constructing the silence, there needed to be the sense that the silence is like this tape, this floor. It looks inert. But if I bang on it that hard, it actually hurts. Because what actually this inert floor is trillions of swarming electrons in constant flux, and they're pushing back on my knuckles, the electrons in my knuckles, and hurting me. And I wanted to create the sense of not the swarm of emotions that lie below the silence, not the fear that lies below the silence, or the violence that lies below the silence, but the violence, intense and precarious coexistence in equilibrium that constitutes that silence. So there's two ways I kind of worked with that in the film. One is Well, maybe three. One is that I defined the film from the beginning to be precisely formally complementary to the act of killing in this way. If you see the uncut version of the act of killing, every sequence ends in a kind of abrupt cut to silence, these kind of haunted landscape shots. And these are shifts in the perspective of the film abruptly from the perpetrators to the absent dead. And whom I hope haunt every frame of the act of killing. And I wanted somehow in the second film to immerse you as viewers in any of those haunted spaces and make you feel what would it be like to rebuild a life there, surrounded by the people who killed your loved ones, always afraid, amidst the rubble of the killings. And I created this sound design which involved something like 16 layers, independent layers of crickets, sometimes solo, sometimes a chorus of crickets. And in editing and doing the sound work, and we had 10 weeks for the sound on this film. It's about as much as would go into a low-budget feature fiction film, not a normal documentary. We would work very carefully with the layers so that in an intimate scene, you would have, I would have a solo cricket dominating with no reverb. And in a big landscape, there'd be a chorus of crickets and more reverb on the solo crickets, like playing the crickets like a symphony. Something else Robert Bresson says is use no music, use no score, let the sounds be the score. And doing that, I was trying to create a haunted space, this sense of a pulsing, haunted, swarming silence, swarming with ghosts. And those beams became the third way that I tried to work with that. I felt that it's the thing that is so subtle that if they were on the ground and you'd walk past them in the forest, you would never notice that they're moving. They would just look like nothing, like pebbles. But if you stopped and listened and watched, you would see them ever so slightly jumping. And I felt that that was somehow a metaphor, not only for this, because every metaphor in film must have an enduring mystery beyond what one can explain in words, but I felt that those beams became a kind of there was a feeling of that if you just look hard enough and listen hard enough and look closely enough and feel and open yourself, you will feel the dead that need to be remembered and buried properly. And there's a hope there. And at the end of the film, Rohani says, "Please come out, or are you not even there?"
It breaks my heart.
I'm seeing my head being cut off by the woman in the back. It's as though I hope it just means stop talking. And,
thank you for giving me that segue as well. We are going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but thank you, Joshua Oppenheimer.